What's up guys, welcome back to another video. Today it's the turn of Renault to launch their RS19 race car that they hope Daniel Ricciardo and Nico Hülkenberg will be able to, I guess at best or at least, let's say, cement that fourth place in the championship. It's a digital render release again, so it's a shame. I really don't like the fact that teams are doing this now. I understand, of course, why they do it. They don't want to release too many technical details. They don't want to release the actual, manufactured components because by that point they've committed to certain designs by the time they manufacture something. So by doing it digitally, they can at least hold back some of those things, some of those developments, until the car hits the racetrack. So I totally get it, but of course it's frustrating for you and I. Let's take a look then, because this is a digital render, but I think it does give us some idea as to some of the concepts that Nick Chester, chief designer down at Renault, and his team have taken here. And there are some clear influences from other cars that we might recognise. Let's start then by looking at it front on. And the first thing that you notice on this car, compared to some of the other cars that we've seen already, is the difference in the front wing. We already know that it's much simpler this year. We know it's wider, so we've now got the full width of the car, 2 meters wide. But this one stands out as being different from the others we've seen so far. Much lower to the ground and much flatter all the way across its entire span. Pretty much level. It obviously kicks up at the ends a little bit, but nowhere near as dramatic as, for example, the one we saw on the Toro Rosso yesterday, which had this big scoop rising up. Now that allows for more scope above the main plane of the wing here for elements, but Renault haven't taken up all of that space that they're allowed. Now you could potentially read into that but perhaps they don't need as much front downforce, or they've got enough front downforce from what you see here. Perhaps it means that if they created more front downforce, perhaps they're unable to balance that at the rear of the car, so this is what they've settled on. As I say, a digital render, this will all change at some point over testing and certainly the first few races, but quite an interesting design. Because they've got this very flat lower main plane here, it means that the elements above it are very sculpted, aren't they? And a very different concept to the others, where we've got really low outboard tips of those upper flaps connected to the flat, very straight again end plate. Minimal outwash allowed on those end plates this year, as we've discussed. But what they're trying to do here, because we've got minimal outwash allowed on the end plates, and they're a very flat, very straight end plate now, it's very difficult, or much more difficult, for the teams to generate the outwash that they really need. They need to drag an outwash away from the front tyre to try and take away the messy, turbulent air from that tyre. So that's why they wanted outwash in the first place. So now they're trying all sorts of means to gain some of that lost outwash back. And this seems to be Renault's take on it, in that they've dipped these flaps right down to a much more condensed area on the side of the end plate there, allowing a sort of sculpted lower path for the airflow to rise up and potentially follow. There is a little kick out on the end plate. There's sort of the maximum you're allowed with the 2019 regs. And by lowering all four of these upper flaps together to a lower point here, they're hoping, I guess, to encourage some of that airflow to follow this path, take the path of the tiny little kick of the end plate and go outboard of the front tyre. That will be the thinking behind it. Of course, more inboard, they've got this very high risen up sections at the most inboard point of the flaps, separate flaps as we saw in previous versions, each one, as we talked about yesterday, creating the vortex that will then be spiralling off through the front suspension to be picked up by the barge boards. Little stays connecting the individual flaps. Now these, it's difficult to see from the picture, but these will be used, even if only minimally, to try and direct the airflow to where the teams want it. Teams won't put anything on a Formula 1 car that they cannot make the best use of possible. So even a stay that's there for support reasons will be used aerodynamically at some point. We don't have the IR sensor, the infrared sensor pod, that we will almost certainly have, because that's another area that you're allowed within the regulations, and if teams can exploit that, which they will for aerodynamic benefit, it will almost certainly be on there by the time we go testing, certainly by the time we go racing. So really quite interesting front wing, I guess, in terms of comparing it to the other ones we've seen. The nose cone and the nose tip, very similar to last year. Thumb tip, I guess, with these scoops either side of the support brackets, just helping to drive airflow through that channel and into the centre section underneath the car, where the barge boards and the floor section will then take hold of it and divert it off to where they need to go. So quite interesting from that perspective. Front suspension looks relatively similar, I guess, to last year. They've got very big brake duct scoops. Again, that will shrink down for certain circuits, I'm sure, but none of the flick-ups, none of the winglets that we saw last year, they've all gone with the 2019 regs. Wing mirrors, a different concept to some of the other teams. Longer stalks, but they've chosen to raise the wing mirrors up to a higher position. To me, that looks like it's less being exploited for aerodynamic benefit, and they've perhaps, bizarrely for a Formula 1 team, actually looked at maybe the optimum position for visibility from those mirrors, rather than actually trying to use them for aerodynamic gain, which the other teams clearly have, by placing them right out here to allow this stalk to become a winglet, which helps to direct airflow down onto the bodywork. I suspect that may well change, because it seems too good an area to pass up an opportunity on at this point. Vortex generators just at the top of the side pods here, which we'll see on lots of teams, I'm sure, just to help spin up some vortex or vortices, which then help to energise the airflow and keep it attached to the bodywork as it follows its way down towards the coke bottle and the rear of the car. The airbox, very similar in shape to last year, different to some of the other teams, but similar to the ones they had last year, I guess. You can see from the side view here just how flat and simple the front wing end plates are this year. There is a slight curvature on there, but look, a foot plate that runs front to rear. Again, we saw something slightly different on the Haas, where it stopped around about here to try and kick up a vortex a little bit earlier. They haven't gone for that at this point, but these will all be things that this is going to be a big area of development because it's new. Teams will be learning all the time, they'll be producing new parts all the time, trying things in wind tunnels right now that have moved way beyond this. I mean, when I was working at McLaren, I remember getting to the first race of a Grand Prix season with the 13th iteration of a front wing. By the time we got to the first race, that's the sort of scale of development within Formula 1. And nowadays, of course, by trying things in CFD, you can actually go through far more versions without actually having to produce them. The wheels are going to be an area of development this year as well. We saw Mercedes playing around with kind of blown rims last year. You can't blow airflow through the axles anymore. We're not allowed to have those with the new regulations. So any airflow that can be passed through the rim to help encourage some of that outwash will be an area that teams will try and exploit this year. So I expect that to be something that people will be trying over the course of pre-season testing as well. Moving slightly further back, you can see nicely sculpted barge boards. These are some of the nicest that we've seen, certainly in terms of their form factor and their sculpting. Some of the others have been very basic, and I expect this is going to be an area of huge development as well. These are lower, they're further forward, they are less complicated than last year, but they've perhaps got an even more important job because of the minimal ability now of the front wing to deal with the turbulent wake of the front tyre. The barge boards now, and this area here, now potentially have a bigger job to do in that regard, because that's the area that now has to pick up the big vortex coming off the front wing, or vortices coming off the front wing, and manage it outboard to help drag away that messy turbulent wake from the front tyre, away from all these sensitive areas of the car and the car's floor. So this has an important job to do, and I expect teams again will be trying lots of different iterations of that over the coming weeks. Some of these sections here, these vertical strakes, are similar to what we saw on the Renault of last year, perhaps just cut down to adhere to the 2019 regulations, which are a bit more strict in that area. So perhaps nothing new, but just a kind of evolution of maybe what they had before. Difficult to see from the picture, but it looks like a nicely heavily sculpted leading edge of the floor beneath the side pod opening. Again, being used there to separate airflow and drive airflow around the side of this sculpted bodywork and in towards the Coke bottle section of the floor. A really important area of the car. One of the other things that stands out, and you can kind of see it already in this picture, is the rake. Huge amount of rake this year, almost Red Bull-esque amount of rake. You can see how low the front of the T-tray, or the splitter, is to the ground there. Similarly, the front wing, we saw that very low, very straight front wing. I'm imagining that that front wing design is very much been created in tandem with this extreme high rake concept. And the point of that is to maximise the effect of the diffuser. The whole underfloor essentially becomes an extension of the diffuser, rising up, squeezing airflow through this very narrow channel here at incredibly high speed, and then starting the diffusion process all the way up here, pulling airflow through there, starting to diffuse it. When it gets to the diffuser, it obviously expands very rapidly out into the ambient pressures behind the car, but it has the effect of moving the aero balance forward, because the airflow is fastest underneath the car at the point just before it starts to expand into that diffuser. So on this particular car, where we've got the rake in such an extreme angle, the centre of aero balance will be moved much further forward than it is on a much flatter angle of attack on some of the other cars that we've seen. So that'll be the concept behind it, but being a relatively new concept, certainly to this level at Renault, it'll definitely be something they will have to work on, they'll have to develop, and it's not just a case of jacking the back of the car up. As I say, it's a concept that has to be designed into your overall packaging, right from the front wing all the way through the car. Looking from overhead then, one of the things that stands out is just how simple the floor is on these renders. I don't imagine it's going to stay like that at all. You know, we've seen on other cars longitudinal splits or slots in the floor, tyre squirt slots just before here, all designed to try and deal with the tyre wake and prevent it from either going underneath the floor and prevent the floor, high-speed airflow underneath the floor from escaping. So I imagine that this is a very simplified render and won't be representative of the eventual floor on the car. Now, given that this is a digital render, we'll take some of this with a slight pinch of salt. But what we can tell from the rear here, you can see just how wide the rear wing is now. We've got a much wider rear wing, a much higher rear wing as well, and we also know that the DRS flap is also 20mm deeper as well. So when that opens, we're going to be dumping a huge amount more drag than we were back in 2018, combined with the fact that the whole upper planes are much higher and in much cleaner airflow than they were before. That drag is going to be huge when it gets dumped by the DRS flap opening. It's going to be really interesting to see how that affects the racing and the overtaking throughout 2019. Could we have actually too big an effect with the DRS? We'll have to wait and see. One of the things we can tell from this is a very basic idea of how the exhaust layout is on the Renault, with the two wastegate pipes situated just below and to either side. We've seen on other cars, the Ferrari for example, the wastegate pipe sitting on top of the main tailpipe, perhaps to help to narrow in the bodywork around it, but also potentially by raising the wastegate pipes up, are they able to then somehow use some of that exhaust blowing underneath the rear wing? Much more difficult this year with a higher rear wing, but I notice here that Renault have a very small monkey seat situated just above the tailpipe, and that will be there to help, first of all, generate some downforce, but much more importantly, control the exhaust gases, potentially directing them up towards the underside of that rear wing. If you can blow hot, high energy exhaust gases underneath that rear wing, you can increase the pressure difference between top and bottom and generate more downforce with it. As I say, it becomes more difficult this year because the rear wing is much higher, but if there's an opportunity to do it, even to a small degree, teams will definitely take it. Rear suspension, relatively standard by the look of it, and actually very similar to what they had last year by the look of it. So nothing revolutionary in terms of Formula 1, but there are definitely some ideas that are revolutionary to Renault, and I think lots of ideas that look to me to have come, at least be inspired by last year's Red Bull car, which of course they had very close access to. They had worked very closely with them over the last few years. It would be no surprise if that is exactly what they've done. It's taken some of those concepts and applied them to this year's Renault car. This is a car that I have high hopes for, combined with their new driver lineup as well. I would love to see them, you know, I'd love to see them cement 4th place, but I'd really love them to kick on and start attacking the top 3, to start closing that huge gulf between the top 3 and everybody else. And from Renault's perspective, they're a manufacturer spending a huge amount of money. They're building a team in terms of personnel, in terms of resources, in terms of equipment at their factory at Enstone. They are a team that have higher hopes. Whether they will come to fruition this year, we'll have to wait and see, but certainly over the next few years, 2021 and beyond, this is a team that is desperately hoping they can be right at the very front of the field. I just wonder if this car might take them just a tiny bit closer to that throughout 2019.